How are you handling change? Perhaps it's easy and effortless for you. You feel resilient and flexible. Or perhaps it's not so easy. You feel like you have cement wrapped around your boots. You're frustrated and you're stuck. I think that's the point. That all of us experience change differently, all of us manage change differently, and we measure change differently. Right now, across the globe, change has become the constant. And actually, when I sort of forecast into the future, I think that that may be the way it is for the rest of my life, that change will be the constant. It is my job to understand how am I managing that change and how am I working with other people and essentially matching where they are in their change process. I'm Renée Safrata, the CEO and founder of Vivo Team. One of my favorite statements is that shift happens, and I truly believe that. I'd like to share a little bit about my story and then talk more about this whole idea of managing and measuring the pace of change. And shift happens. So I have had an entrepreneurial career. I'm on my 5th business, and what I decided to do 10 years ago was essentially to create a complete pivot for my business. What that meant is I had been a consultant in the learning and development space, and I was providing corporations with facilitated trainings in a classroom environment. I did my research and I realized that change was upon us and that probably in 2020 things would go digital. Training and development would be most effective if it was in a virtual instructor-led format. So 10 years ago I did the research. I made the decision to get a group of people together around me who were willing to make a pivot and to essentially dive into the unknown, peeking around the corners, making some guesses about what could happen. With that team, we first articulated the best outcome for teams and leaders across the globe, how they could connect, learn, and develop together. What would that look like? Once we had figured out what the successful outcome looked like, we had to then put in milestones in place to go along our implementation path. That was as an internal team. So I'll pause there in the story for the moment. I can only imagine that you can see the difference, that because I created that pivot and that change for my company, I've had the liberty of time to do things well, to do things slowly, and to engage people in that shift happens path, to manage the pace of change with the liberty of time. I also know that this pandemic dealt a hand of decisions for many companies. People had chosen that they were going to implement change, but all of a sudden the pandemic threw down its ugly hand and said, you are changing now. And we hear that a lot of companies are 5 years beyond where they thought they would be today because they have embraced that change and they've moved forward. While other companies remain stuck, still thinking that possibly this whole thing's going to get forgotten and we'll just go back to normal. Well, that's the pace of change. Some people are managing it with easy effortlessness, flow, and just flying forward, while others are a little bit stuck. So I guess my point is to consider for you, where are you personally? Where is your team around managing the pace of change? And what is the whole perspective around what can be done and what can't be done? I'd like to share a little bit of what I think are sort of the successful steps to manage change and the pace of change effectively. Again, remembering shift happens. So we have to be a little bit flexible with it. Number one, this whole idea of figuring out what does a best case scenario look like. We may not know what all of the outcomes are, but we can guess on some top high-level points that we would make a philosophy or a theory that a best outcome will look like this. The second thing that we need to do with that theory, that concept, is to get the people around the table and make sure that they are aligned to that idea, even though there are a number of unknowns. Once we have the decision of this is what a best case scenario is going to look like, then we can start to path out, again, with a lot of unknowns, what key implementation milestones might be. So that's number one. Getting the whole idea of what is the change that's going to happen and how do we need to implement across a change pathway. Number two is this whole idea about alignment. Understanding, like I said at the beginning of this video, is this whole idea that people in our humanness, we embrace change at different paces. So to really get a clear understanding around the people that are around the table of what is their willingness to move quickly or their willingness to move slowly. And how can those who are willing to move quickly possibly influence those who are willing to move slowly? And how can those who are willing to move slowly influence those who are willing to move quickly? Because the truth is, there's no right or wrong answer. It's more about managing together and collaborating together. As well, being very flexible that we will encounter moving 2 steps forward, but we'll have to be resilient with the fact that we may move 3 steps back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But yet along the long-term path, we will get there. So again, number one, figure out the path, figure out the implementation plan. Number two, think about people and the pace of change, the willingness to influence one another. And number three, then to think really about monitoring and measuring that pace of change. Not personalities and resistance and that type of thing, but behaviors. What are the behaviors that are indicating to me that my fellow colleague or coworker is having difficulty pushing through to this one little decision, this one little yes that actually is critical to the path unfolding? What's the resistance? What are the behaviors that I'm seeing? Think about that as almost taking your iPhone or your mobile device and tracking on a video the behavior you see. Perhaps in meetings, that individual is resistant to bringing forward their viewpoint or resistant to bringing forward a decision or even a suggestion of how to step back. Those are behaviors. Think about behaviors, not personality. If we can look at behaviors, then together we can speak to those behaviors and we can notice those behaviors and encourage or be willing to influence the other and have some really, really deep conversations about how we are monitoring and measuring the progress and the pace of change. Because again, shift happens. Number 4 is to think about this whole idea of the domino effect. So this is something that really sort of, I think I didn't plan for, and I think in my story came out of the blue. While I was so focused on this whole idea of implementing change for learning and development and our delivery online, I failed to consider that absolutely everything else within the company had to go online. That meant our operations. And once operations was online, that meant our injections or interactions and conversations with our prospects and our sales process. That had to be online. So it was a little bit of the domino effect. You're going down such a rabbit hole of figuring out this one problem, but actually then the domino effect of change starts to cascade and be important that you pay attention to that. So number 1, you've got the path, you've implemented a structure. Number 2, you've thought about the people and their pace of change and how their pace of change needs to be communicated at every step, whether you're moving forward or you're moving back. Number 3, you have to monitor what's happening with behaviors. And number 4, you have to really think about this whole idea of the domino effect. Once this changes, what else is going to have to change? And the last one is to measure how your internal change is keeping pace with your external stakeholders. I have an interesting story about this. What I know about Vivo Team is that as soon as we had everything, all cylinders working remotely, delivering our products, operations, sales, everything was online, categorized, libraried, working as a functional machine. I wasn't actually that real to the fact that when COVID hit, everything changed for our external market. What I didn't realize that at the level that I should have realized perhaps was that everybody had choice. They had choice to choose Vivo Team to do everything online or to remain with one of our competitors and do everything in the old classroom setting. But once COVID hit, choice was gone for everybody that we knew. So all of a sudden, with choice gone, people came running to work with us because they knew that we had had the liberty of time to figure it out over time, and we probably were excelling at this point. We weren't sort of trying to stitch it together. So I offer that as a piece of the story to consider as well, that you're also not only thinking about internal change, but you're thinking about how is the market ready or the public ready for the change that you're implementing. Because truthfully, there could be a couple steps back that you need to go to engage, to get that buy-in and alignment from your external stakeholders before they can match your pace of change. I hope that's helpful. So my idea here is that shift happens, that we are in a global situation where change is the norm, and it might be the norm going forward. And that really, if you think about this whole idea of shift happens, but if I manage, if I monitor, and if I match the pace of change of others, I might have a winning formula. I'm Renée Safrata, Vivo Team.